couple of malign developments that have only increased in intensity over the last 5 years or so. It's no secret that liberal democracy, one of the basic pillars of Western civilization, is experiencing a crisis. A kind of fire has started in the theater of Western culture. And there's nobody out there with anywhere near the gravitas and the influence and the oratorical skills of a Churchill, pointing to the blaze that is constantly getting bigger and bigger. What is the crisis? The crisis consists of an attack from both within and without upon a range of our political norms and customs. After a long and prosperous spell of the existence of those norms, we may have been too rash in assuming their invulnerability. The norms have not yet been broken, but they are bending. Events are increasingly demonstrating that we cannot take them for granted. As we are sadly learning, no norms can be deemed permanent by virtue of their integrity alone. They demand never-ending vigilance. At times like these, they require spirited defense. They require, to be specific, in my view, an American Churchill. I justify saying that this person should be American by virtue of the leading role that the US has played, and is continuing to play on the world stage for the last 80 years or so in the defense of liberal democracy, and the role the country has played since its birth 2.5 centuries ago in defense of constitutional democracy. The US, for better or worse, is still the indispensable country. Why do I designate Churchill as the avatar of truth we need at this moment in history? Why Winston Churchill? A brief detour back in time to a pivotal moment, 81 years ago, the month of May, 1940. At no point in the history of Western civilization did our norms and customs require a more spirited defense than during that month in that year. The defense was offered up by Winston Churchill. May 1940, Churchill has just become prime minister. France will very soon fall to the invading Germans. Western Europe will lie subjugated under the boot of Hitler. Nazi military might appears invincible. At this juncture, May of 1940, there is zero prospect that Hitler's victories can be overturned. His next step, his obvious next target, the British Isles. It was at this precise moment in his long career that Churchill made his greatest contribution to humanity. His leadership was still fragile because it was barely days old. He was still widely despised within his own party. Voices within his own cabinet, powerful voices, Lord Halifax, if you've read the history, demanded talks with Germany. Hitler at this point, May of 1940, was not adverse to talking to Britain, not adverse to negotiating, because he was already the master of Europe. He could set the terms. He could exact Germany's full measure of revenge for its 1918 defeat. Consider the burden of decision on Britain's prime minister. The pressure on him was beyond imagining. On the one hand, his country was caught at the edge of an abyss. On the other hand, he could pull his country back from the precipice if he agreed to negotiate. The continent was lost, but Britain could be spared. The pivotal moment had come. Fortunately for Britain, providentially for Europe, and by extension for Western civilization, Churchill knew the nature of the enemy better than anyone. He rejected all pressure to talk peace with the Nazi barbarian. Let me interject at this moment to show you the best book that I've ever read vis-a-vis those early days of his prime ministership. It's called 5 Days in London by May 1940 by this historian John Lukacs. And it really describes in detail the tremendous pressure on Churchill to give in, not to put Britain into the eye of the storm and continue the war, but to negotiate with Hitler. Well, he didn't, providentially. Here was principled leadership upheld under the most dire of circumstances. Britain could not possibly have won the war alone. But what Churchill did in May of 1940 was ensure that Western civilization would not lose the war to Nazi barbarism. So that ends our little detour. Back to the present day, whether or not we want to believe it, we are again being threatened by fascism. On two fronts, I referred at the beginning of these remarks to a couple of malign political developments that have only increased in intensity over the last few years. The first is the blatant authoritarian direction that now characterizes the political trajectory of the Republican Party in the United States. Incredibly, that is not an exaggeration. The other malign development, the other front in the undeclared war, is the actual advance of fascism or other forms of despotism in more and more countries of the world. Consider first the highly potential catastrophe developing in the United States. The United States today happens to be the place where the most dangerous attack on liberal democracy is being waged. We can confidently call it the most dangerous, not just because the US is supposed to be the leading light of democracy and the chief exemplar of the rule of law, but because the attack is coming from within, not only from within the country, but from within one of its two principal political parties. You all know what has been going on. The Republican Party, once the party of Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, has become openly anti-democratic, intent on suppressing the Black vote. The Republican Party, once the party of Dwight Eisenhower, the man who led the Western forces that liberated Western Europe, has become a party more aligned with the agenda of Vladimir Putin than the Constitution of the United States. The Republican Party is fighting in dozens of states to suppress the minority vote, the Black vote, the youth vote, because those blocs predominantly vote Democratic. It is waging this fight in deference to the bright and shining big lie that the election was stolen in 2020 from Donald Trump. That the election was stolen from the pathological liar from Fifth Avenue. Propagated with the support of Fox News and other media, if it was not true, it would be laughable. It is terrifying that the Republican Party remains beholden to a pathetic, illiterate clown, a man whom his own Secretary of State once called an effing moron. The man is clearly, indisputably, a wannabe Mussolini, a wannabe authoritarian. The most important conclusion we can draw from the current political condition of the United States is this: if we take the view from 10,000 feet up and look down, what we see is what was once the leading country of the free world, a country effectively flirting with fascism. The Republicans, of course, would protest against that description, but their intellectual honesty has gone off, their intellectual dishonesty, has gone off the charts. They simply don't give a damn. They've become totally shameless. They are not just flirting with fascism, they are actively promoting and advocating it. Back to Timothy Snyder's equation. Post-truth equals pre-fascism. In the 1930s, when the flames of fascism were out in the open and threatening all of Europe, we had a Winston Churchill yelling, "Fire." It's true that the powers that be at that time largely ignored him, but his prescience and his persistence would be a couple of the factors that eventually installed him in Downing Street, where he was most needed and when he was the indispensable man. to be there. Who have we got of comparable stature in the United States? Who with gravitas and charisma and oratory is pushing the alarm buttons? One of the greatest disappointments of this passage in US politics is that there could have been one. There was a viable candidate for the job. In the early days of the 2016 election, when the most disgraceful campaign in the history of the United States was on its way to winning the Republican nomination, one leading Republican made a fabulous speech. He condemned the shame that was unfolding within his own party. He tore apart the sociopath from New York. He made the case against Trump with wit and elegance. His name was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney had the credentials. He had the comportment. He had the oratorical skills, but then he blew it. He became a hypocrite. After Trump was elected, Romney went to have dinner with the president-elect. He had the vain hope of being named Secretary of State. Of course, we now know why the sociopath from New York even entertained Mitt Romney. It was to take revenge on him. It was to have the means to mock and belittle him. Trump basically has one policy in life and one policy for all departments of life. It's to take revenge on anybody who ever crosses him. But that's another story. As for the Romney story, his subsequent votes for impeachment somewhat redeemed him and indicated again that he is a man of some honor, but they did not take him off the hook. He has not done enough. He never crossed the floor. He should have taken to heart the experience of Churchill in the 1930s and accepted his own wilderness years. He should have denounced his party and deserted it. Imagine what that would have done. Imagine what that would do even today. He cravenly did not do so and does not do so. I'm convinced that someday someone will write a biography of Mitt Romney and entitle it Romney, the Un-Churchill of America. I mentioned two developments in the world that cry out for the emergence of an American Churchill. I've talked about the Republican Party's romance with fascism. Now take a look at what is happening elsewhere in the world. In 1992, a writer by the name of Francis Fukuyama made himself famous by writing a book called The End of History. What was his rationale? The Soviet Union had collapsed the year before. Communism was suddenly a dinosaur. The Cold War was over. The values of the West had triumphed. It looked like clear sailing for human rights, representative government, market economies, international harmony, et cetera, all based on a common vision. Mr. Fukuyama's declaration was an exercise in hyperbole, but it made a certain kind of sense. For a brief moment in time, we could dream that the values of liberal democracy would never again suffer a serious challenge. It was the end of history, except, of course, it wasn't. Look at where we are today in Russia, in China, in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland, in Venezuela, in the Philippines. Nationalist movements, even in countries like France and the United Kingdom, threaten those countries' traditional values. In two of the three most militarily powerful countries in the world, Russia and China, liberal democracy remains a pipe dream. Both of those countries, which together comprise almost a third of the world's population, both of those countries are led by men who can only be described as autocrats or totalitarians. And both Russia and China make no secret of their expansionist tendencies. China into the Pacific and Russia constantly glowering over the Soviet Union's former satellites. Putin has been notoriously known to decry the end of the Soviet Union and considers it one of the worst tragedies in history. all of which adds urgency to the need for an American Churchill. The original Churchill is the man who rang the loudest alarm bell in the 1930s, but he did it after the war as well. His influence on affairs did not stop when he was out of office. Some historians say the contributions he made in the year 1946 compare in importance to the stand he took in 1940. He made 2 speeches for the ages in 1946. By the way, as a side note, after his defeat in the 1945 election, his wife Clementine said to him that being out of office might prove to be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied to her that, and I quote, "Yes, it seems quite effectively disguised." The fact of the matter is, Churchill might not have made the 2 pivotal speeches he made in 1946 if he were indeed still prime minister. The first speech was delivered in Fulton, Missouri, with Harry Truman sitting in the audience. It was the famous Iron Curtain speech, in which Churchill powerfully warned the world about Soviet domination over Eastern Europe and what it meant for Soviet ambition going forward. Churchill himself called it the most important speech he ever made. There was a new enemy, a new hungry tyranny. Stalin was the new Hitler. And Churchill, again, more than anyone, saw the menace. That speech could be called the first wake-up call that eventually resulted in the creation of NATO. Later in the same year of 1946, Churchill spoke in Zurich and proposed what was then still an astonishing idea, namely a partnership between France and Germany. Who ever heard of such a thing? He saw such a partnership as the basis for a United States of Europe. That speech could be called the first stirring of what would become the European Common Market and eventually the European Union, another bulwark against Soviet expansionism. Let me conclude with this. We have reason to hope that the United States will muddle through its current domestic crisis and help the wider world keep the despots at bay. But although I have tremendous respect for Joseph R. Biden, unfortunately, he is no Winston S. Churchill. So we have reason to be afraid, very afraid. Now, please tell me why you think I might be wrong, because I wish to be persuaded that I am wrong.
Michael, first of all, thank you very much for that. That was amazing, very compelling, extremely eloquent. I hope you have a chance to deliver this again and to a bigger audience. But a lot of food for thought there. But first, I have a question. Do you see any other candidates other than Mitt Romney?
Well, you know, I was going to mention in a kind of negative way, Liz Cheney, because she did some very good work vis-a-vis indicting Trump for the insurrection. But then she's interviewed and asked, what about all of these Republican efforts to suppress the votes in all of these states? And she didn't say a word to counter what is obviously a fascistic move on the part of her own party.
Yeah.
Not a chance. Adam Kinzinger is getting a lot of press and he gets to be interviewed quite a bit on cable television, CNN and MSNBC. A very good man, eloquent, but he's a relatively young man. He doesn't have the gravitas yet, possibly in the future, but no, I don't see anyone else.
Okay. The Democrats?
I really fear 2024, because if Kamala Harris is the candidate, then that lights a fire under all of the bigots, the misogynists, the fascists, the Nazis, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, all of the bad extremists and conspiracy theorists. It lights a fire under them and causes them to be more active in the election, and I fear that she might lose to a Trump-like candidate. I'm hoping that Joseph Biden remains very, very healthy and runs again, because if he does, he would be akin to the Eisenhower years, Eisenhower was elected twice. I think Biden could be, even if he does run at age over 80,